Welcome, STABLE-2007 evaluators and enthusiasts, to this video on the 2017 revision of the STABLE-2007 Evaluator Workbook, what evaluators need to know. My name is Andrew Brankley, and it is my pleasure as first author to share the workbook with you. The content in this video is rated intermediate, which is kind of like getting a bowl of oatmeal that is not too hot or too cold because the content is designed to be accessible to most people, especially evaluators with stable training. If you have any questions or comments about the intended use of this video or its content, please feel free to comment below or email me directly. There are three questions underlying the purpose of this video. Why do we need a revised workbook? What resources are available, and what do you as stable users need to know? By the end of this video, you will have answers to each of these questions. So let's start off with why. This is an important question because changes, even if they are improvements, can be disruptive.
I don't like change. I don't like it when things change. It's unsettling, isn't it?
Indeed. So why do we need a change? Changing the STABLE-2007 workbook was motivated by finding a better way to communicate risk more generally. Risk, as many of you know, is a dimension, just like volume or temperature. It has no inherent breakpoints or categories. The purpose of risk assessment is to determine where an individual falls along this risk dimension. That is why we should be speaking of an individual having a level of risk rather than a category of risk. For example, let's look at Bob's risk level. No, not Bob Dylan. Our Bob is just an example. This is Bob's actual level of risk, the likelihood that he will commit a future crime. But this level of risk does not come stamped on his forehead. We have to assess it, usually with the help of evidence-based risk tools. So let's start off with our first proverbial risk tool, which has 3 risk levels. Using this tool, we would say that Bob's risk is high. Risk tool 2 has 4 levels, and now Bob's risk would be described as moderate high, even though the only thing we changed was the tool, not the actual risk he poses. Risk tool 3 has 9 levels, and Bob is placed into bin 7. And because using more than one tool is normal, it is challenging for both the readers and writers of risk assessment reports to make sense of these different results. You know, it actually kind of reminds me of vanity sizing in clothing stores. It can be extremely frustrating and limiting when the meaning of a clothing size, or risk level, is influenced as much by the values and branding of the store or tool as the dimensions of the shopper or the risk characteristics of the individual.
Anarchy! 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 I don't even know what that means, but I love it!
To prevent martial law, representatives from the National Reentry Resource Center of the United States, the U.S. Justice Center, Council of State Governments, and Public Safety Canada developed a common language for communicating risk. This language is built upon multiple indicators of risk, including absolute recidivism rates, relative risk parameters, percentiles, as well as supervision and treatment considerations. This language was developed and intended to be used for adult males convicted of a crime, but discussion is beginning about its application to other groups, such as women and adolescents. If you want to learn more about the standardized risk levels, please see the links below for the main report, the journal article describing the application of the standardized risk levels to sexual crime, and, if you're anything like me and only have 5 minutes to read something, a 5-minute blog I wrote summarizing the framework. I will be developing a publicly available video going into more detail about the standardized risk levels, but in the meantime, I will summarize them. The 5 risk levels are primarily described by their Roman numeral, 1 through 5. Sometimes nominal descriptions have been given to the risk levels, but these should always be in addition to, not in place of, their numerical level. Level 1 is for individuals who have no current propensities for sexual crime. These individuals are essentially pro-social, and although they have done something awful in the past, they are expected to desist from future sexual offending when released into the community. Level 2 is for individuals who have 1 or 2 risk-relevant problems to be addressed in community supervision. These individuals typically are expected to move down to level 1 after successfully completing programming or after time offense-free in the community. Level 3 is for the average individual convicted of a sexual offense in a routine sample. These individuals often have a handful of risk-relevant issues that need to be addressed in traditional sex offense-specific treatment programs. After 5 years in the community, we expect 7 to 10% of these individuals to be convicted of a new sexual offense. This is the average rate of sexual offending in routine or complete samples. Risk level 4 is for individuals who have several chronic problems, making their risk 2 to 4 times greater than the average person in level 3. Because of the very large range between level 3, around 10%, and the 85% cutoff for level 5, level 4 is divided into 2 halves, 4A and 4B. This is to help describe and communicate changes in the severity of risk that doesn't move them into a level 3 or a level 5. Although we may speak of levels 4A and 4B separately, the difference is quantitative, not qualitative. Both are in level 4. And level 5 is for individuals we are virtually certain are going to reoffend. That translates into an absolute risk of about 85% or more after 5 years in the community. In discussions of risk for sexual offending, we don't often speak of level 5. This is not because individuals at level 5 do not exist, but that most tools cannot reliably discriminate between level 4B and level 5 across this 85% threshold. For more on the application of the standardized risk levels to sexual offending, please see Hansen and colleagues' 2017 paper in Psychological Assessment. The link to this paper is provided below. In this paper, they also describe how to use static 99R and static 2002R to place evaluees in the standardized risk levels. This created a gap for stable 2007 users who combined their scores with static risk levels.
Wait for me, I got little legs.
Hopefully users didn't feel like they had to wait too long because the stable development team started working on this problem in 2015. My role in this project was to help create and test different ways of using Stable 2007 to optimize an evaluee's placement within the standardized risk level framework. The revised Stable 2007 workbook is based upon these results and several other improvements to benefit Stable users. So now that you have a better idea of why we revised the workbook, let's turn to what resources are available to learn about the workbook or to educate others. There are 3 resources available for evaluators to use. The first is the Evaluator workbook itself. If you don't have a copy of the workbook yet, please contact your Stable 2007 trainer, and if you have difficulties with that, please email me with your name and the date of your Stable training. Beyond improved combination rules, we also updated some of the Stable 2007 norms, provided report writing templates, and condensed the format of the overall workbook to make it a little bit more user-friendly. It may be useful to have the workbook open as I will be using that square box in the top right-hand corner of my slides to let you know which page number in the workbook has the information being referred to on the slide. The second resource is this video, which will remain available to Stable 2007 users to watch. If you want to quote or reference this video, please do so. You can use this reference on the screen. The last resource is the companion slide deck that accompanies this video. You can find the URL to download the slides in the links below. These slides are free and yours to use and share with your colleagues. As always, please cite and acknowledge the source. To make this easier, I have placed a small copyright on the bottom of each of the slides. So finally, what do you as Stable users need to know about the new workbook? Well, let's begin with the new Stable 2007 norms. For those following along, please refer to page 5. The original sample from the Dynamic Supervision project included 795 people, a respectable size. But to be frank, the new sample dwarfs the DSP considerably. This 4,292 person sample comes from the beautiful Canadian province of British Columbia. If you can't quite picture BC, it is famous for its clear blue lakes, grizzly bears, and sci-fi and horror TV shows for teenagers. With the help of Carmen Zabrakis, we collected almost an entire cohort of adult males convicted of sexual offenses from 2005 to 2013. Our sample includes everyone who was supervised in the community by the province and had an index or prior sexual offense. This provided us with a diverse sample. As you can see, 1/3 of the sample identified as non-Caucasian, and almost a quarter of the sample were Indigenous Canadians. This figure compares stable 2007 scores on the x-axis with the percent of either the DSP or the BC sample on the y-axis at that score. As you can see, the distribution of scores for both samples overlap remarkably well, meaning that they are comparable. The combined sample gives us over 5,000 people representing all parts of Canada and 2 American states. In or near each province on this figure, I have indicated how many people each region contributed to the normative sample used for percentiles and frequency data. This second slide is exactly the same as the first, except it only has the regions that contributed to the recidivism estimates. This does not include the 2 American states or the new BC sample, and this is the same sample used in previous editions of the workbook. So let's move on to the updated item frequency data. This table is a replication of what you can find on page 7 of the workbook. The first column is a list of stable 2007 items. The next 3 columns have the percent of the sample who had either a 0, 1, or 2 at that score. The sample size for each item changes slightly based upon the number of people for whom we had data. Although useful for report writing, I do not think this table is the best way to visually represent the data. In this slide, I'm going to show you the same data, but I'm going to be using bar graphs. These blue bars represent the percent of the full sample scoring a 0 on each item. It becomes really clear that over half of the sample scored 0 on these 8 highlighted items. Another way of thinking about it is that clients in routine samples often demonstrate no problems in these areas. The stacked orange bars show the percent of people who scored 1 on stable 2007 items. The score of 1 is actually more common than a score of 0 for about 5 items. Lastly, the stacked red bars indicate the number of people who scored a 2 on stable 2007 items. These scores are generally abnormal except for item 2, capacity for relationship stability. Overall, this visual display may be useful for promoting discussion amongst your colleagues about what is normal and what you should expect when scoring someone on stable 2007. If you turn to page 8 of the workbook, you can see the updated information on stable 2007 total scores. Stable total scores range from 0 to 26, 24 if the client has never offended against a child. To the right of the total scores, you will see a count of the number of people at each score. On the right-hand side of the page, I have placed a horizontal bar graph using the raw count data, not percentages, so that longer bars have more people in it than the shorter bars do. As you can see on the far left, the scores are still divided into low, moderate, and high ranges. This is a bit of an aside, but the development team is emphasizing that these 3 levels represent the density of criminogenic needs rather than risk level. A score of 12 doesn't mean high risk, but a high density of risk-relevant problems. Thinking about density of risk factors may be easier if you visualize it like this. Imagine the circle is a score of 2 on an item. Someone in the low range would have maybe 1 or 2 half circles, at most 1 clinically significant problem. Individuals in the moderate range would likely have a few clinically significant problems, represented here as 3 full circles and 1 half circle, to give us the median score of 7. One would expect many clinically significant problems from individuals in the high density level, represented here by 7 full circles. When you look across the 3 figures, you can see our ranges for stable scores reflect how many problems are present within the person. You can also think of the distribution of scores by thinking of rates. This information has replaced the bar graph. Using this, you can make statements like 1.7 people out of 100 will be scored at a 0 on the STABLE 2007, or 2 out of 10 people will be scored in the high density range of problems assessed by STABLE. A more precise way to talk about the distribution of scores is to use percentiles, which have been updated with our new normative sample. We created percentiles by taking our raw frequency data and first turning it into observed percentages. To do that, we took each score, in this case a score of 5, and divided the number of people with that score by the total sample size, and then multiply it by 100 to give us the percent of people with that score. In this case, percent of people with a score of 5 is 9.5. We then summed all lower frequencies and divided by the total score and multiply by 100 to give it the percent scored below, and repeated that for the percent scored above. We also provided you with percentile ranks defined by the midpoint. Overall, what that means is we provided you with the midpoint value between those scoring below and above. With the case of a score of 5, the midpoint value is 36.1%. You can also compute confidence intervals, as you see here. For more on the calculations for midpoint values, see Hansen and colleagues' 2012 paper. So this chart is similar to the one you saw before, but the right-hand side has been replaced with the percentiles defined by the midpoint average. If you are going to only use one kind of percentile in your trainings or reports, we suggest you use these. If you want to go into more detail, you can also describe the number of people who score below, at, or above a given score. These are best used to supplement the percentiles defined by midpoint described previously. So let's move on to the main event, combining STABLE 2007 with the static risk tools. As I said before, the combination rules were a result of over a year of testing and consultation. I presented a bit of the work that went into the evaluating of the rules in Denmark and Orlando in 2016, consulting with STABLE users and researchers. Presently, I am writing up the results for publication and, when it is available, we'll link it to this video. But in the meantime, let's just focus on the best rules we devised. The task at hand is best thought of as optimizing placement within the standardized risk levels. I'm going to be focusing here on static 99R, but the rules apply equally to static 2002R. So in this table, you can see how individuals from our large BC sample are preliminarily placed into the standardized risk levels with static 99R. Individuals with a score of -3 or -2 are placed onto a level 1, and so on. But we know that individuals at the same static score may have different stable scores. Quite different stable scores, as you can see in this table, which takes the exact same people as before, but also takes into consideration the STABLE 2007 score. Each cell now represents the number of people with that static stable score. The concept of disagreement was used to optimize placement within the standardized risk levels. Let me explain to you what I mean. So let's assume that we are using the static and stable in our assessments, and we know that both predict recidivism. So the evaluee scored a -3 on the static 99R, a very low score, the lowest score you can get. But he also scored a 10 on the STABLE 2007. Now intuitively, we are a bit concerned by this combination because a score of 10 is much higher than we would have guessed given his static score. The two tools are giving relevant but conflicting pieces of information, represented here by the red X. So, what do you do? Well, originally, we assumed that everyone would score in the moderate range of stable regardless of the static 99R risk level. This is model agreement, where both stable and static are giving you the same answer. We also assumed that scores in the high range of stable would be higher than expected based on their static score. Same for the lower scores. So in essence, the original rules were based on the assumption that you should be in the moderate stable 2007 range regardless of your static score, and that scores in the high or low stable ranges reflect meaningful disagreement. Let's return to our table of static and stable scores masquerading as a pride flag. So, if we follow the assumptions of the previous combination rules, a stable score of 7 would be the expected score at every single static risk level. So just take a moment to think about that. Does that make sense? Should individuals with a static score of -2 and 9 both be equally likely to have a score of 7 on stable? If you said no, you would be correct. We did some analyses and we found, in fact, that stable scores of 3 are expected at a static risk level 1, and a score of 12 is expected at a static risk level 4B. Very different than 7. These results make sense because the tools are correlated with each other. You can see here in the frequency table how most people are in this oblong circle. So, what does this mean for the combination rules? Well, let me use an example. What stable 2007 score is normal or expected at a static risk level 1? Well, it's a score of 3, and we determine that by using static scores to predict stable scores through a linear regression. When an individual gets a stable 2007 score of 3 at this static risk level, that means the tools are agreeing and you have increased confidence that the individual belongs at a level 1. However, at what point does a stable score tell you that the original static risk level is not optimal? How do we define disagreement? From linear regression, we used the standard error of the estimate, which is about 4.5 stable units. This is the amount of error in our estimated stable score, like a standard deviation. So if someone scores more than 4.5 stable units higher than 3, their high score is unlikely to be due to random measurement error. So we made decision boundaries at 4 and 5 units so we don't get into half scores on the stable. So what about a third boundary? We have the space. We considered that, but we had to look at the number of people out there and stop. No, I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm getting bored of this plain 2D table. Let's put on our 3D glasses. Isn't that more interesting? So this is the exact same information, but I just made it 3D. So at a combined level 1, we can see this tall mountain with purple peaks, meaning we have 15 to 20 people at that cell. But as we move onto a combined level 2 and level 3, the mountain slopes down into a valley, and no one is really present above a stable score of 19. So not only would we have little practical benefit, we don't have enough people at a potential level 4A at this static risk level to empirically test if they're similar to other 4As, to see if they have the same recidivism rates or other characteristics. So we leave it at a level 3. Essentially, if a client scores a -3 or a -2 on static, it would not be unexpected for him to have a score from 0 to 7 on stable. A score of 8 to 12 would be higher than expected, and he should be placed into a level 2. And a score greater than 13 is twice as abnormal, and he should be placed into a level 3. There you go. That's the mechanics of the new rules. Let's do one more example at a static level 2 to make sure my point is clear. At a static level 2, the expected stable score is 5. Using the standard error of the estimate again, we would consider scores of 0 and 1 on stable to be lower than we would expect, indicating the individual should be placed down into a level 1. Scores of 10 or higher on stable mean the individual should be placed into level 3, or even 4A if they score above a stable score of 14. This may all seem complex, but if you stop and take a step back, all I'm saying is that certain stable scores are more common at each static risk level, represented here by the check mark boxes. Some scores are a bit unexpected, represented here by the red X's, and some scores are quite unexpected, represented here by the double X's. This table is the one in your workbook, which illustrates the combination rules. It may seem overwhelming at first, but I promise you will find it easy to use eventually. To find the risk level, you just take the static score on the y-axis and the stable score on the x-axis and find the cell where they overlap. You know, a great metaphor for this process is the game of battleships. Did any of you play battleships growing up? Well, the whole idea behind the game is guessing where your opponent's ship is and blowing up all their ships before they blow up yours. Better players win because they detected patterns in where their opponent tended to place their ships. Just like detecting patterns in what stable scores are more common at each static risk level. So imagine the combination rules like a battleship grid. We've hit our enemy's ship 3 times. Because all of her other ships are down, we know that this is her battleship and it has 1 hit left. But where should I fire? Should I fire here to the right of my last shot? Or should I fire here to the left? I think I'll aim here to the right because that's where I expect her to place her ship. I don't know. What do you think, Admiral Akbar?
We have enemy ships in Sector 27. It's a trap.
Man, I missed. I missed because even though the yellow range is where she normally places her ship, she actually shifted it down into the green zone, meaning a meaningful different change or strategy has been used. If battleships and Star Wars references aren't exactly your cup of tea, let's use a case example. It's on page 9 of your workbook. Fred scores a 1 on static 99R. So we already know that no score on Stable 2007 will drop him into a level 1, but he could be placed in levels 2 all the way through 4B. He scored a 13 on the stable, a higher score than expected based on a static risk level. So his new combined risk level is 4A. So that is the new combination rules, the biggest change to the workbook. If you have any questions on the application or research background, please contact me directly. A new addition to the workbook is risk ratios for the combined static stable risk levels. You'll find these on page 9. Level 3 is the average group, so it has a risk ratio of 1. Risk level 2 has half the risk of risk level 3. Risk level 1 has half the risk of risk level 2 and a quarter of the risk of risk level 3. Risk level 4A, on the other hand, has twice the risk of risk level 3, and risk level 4B has 3 to 4 times the risk of 3. This halving and doubling pattern is no accident, but is one of the useful characteristics of the standardized risk level framework. The presentation of absolute recidivism rates has changed slightly. Instead of being grouped by recidivism type, I have grouped recidivism by risk level. That way, when you identify an evaluee's risk level, all the information you need is close together. Let's take a step back and talk about how the new risk levels compare to the old risk levels. This complex figure will help us to compare the frequencies. On the x-axis, we have the risk levels from the new rules on top and the old rules on bottom. The y-axis is the frequency of people at each risk level. As you can see here, there's been quite a bit of change. The new risk levels form a normal distribution, with levels 1 and 4B being the rarest scores. The old risk rules are positively skewed, where the lowest risk level is in fact the most common. Remember, these two figures use the same sample, just different rules. This figure builds off of the previous one. I have added on the x-axis the 5-year sex recidivism rates. The color and height of the two figures will remain the same. This gives us even more evidence that the two combination rules are different. As you can see, level 1 and low do not refer to the same level of risk. Level 1 is a lower risk group than low. Similarly, the old, very high risk level is higher than the 4B from the new risk level system. But as you can see, it is a very, very small group, even smaller than level 1. So let's switch gears to talk about combination rules with Risk Matrix 2000. Short answer, no changes. Not yet at least, we're currently working on it. We did update the table for the combination rules so that it is visually similar to the new static stable tables. But remember, these are the same rules. I've also added report writing templates and a nifty table on page 19 to help you guide the selection process. Now let's say you're using Stable 2007, and you can either report it in either a simple or detailed format. The simple description is brief and intended for an audience familiar with Stable or in a non-adversarial context. The longer, more detailed description provides more background data on the tool, what information was used to form your ratings, and a table that allows you to compare the evaluee's score with the percent of sample scoring 0 on that item. This can be used to contextualize how abnormal is their item level score. A score of 1 is more abnormal on emotional identification with children because 75% score a 0. A score of 1 would be more normal on deviant sexual interest, where only 35.3% score a 0. If you are integrating stable with static, you can then use the following 3 templates. First, describing their combined risk level, providing some background information, and then placing them using the table on page 10. Like MMPI or PAI reports, you can also provide a standard description of their standardized risk level. For example, someone placed in level 3 could have this paragraph added to their report. After you do that, you can report recidivism estimates. Feel free to take and repeat parts of this paragraph for the recidivism outcomes of interest. All the data will be found around page 11 of your workbook. Lastly, you can describe their risk ratio. Copy this paragraph and then add the appropriate risk ratio section, like this one for level 3. The summary of risk ratios are on the bottom of page 9, but for those of you who love detail, you can find the details on page 36 and 37, where we describe the risk ratios for the different recidivism types and how they were calculated. If instead you are combining stable with risk matrix, you can use the following 2 templates. The first template describes the combined stable risk matrix level, and the next template is for reporting recidivism rates. Lastly, let me just alert you to the additional information held in the workbook appendices. Appendix A provides a detailed summary on the standardized risk level with a table of their main features. Appendix B provides a summary of the different static risk tools that can be combined with stable. Appendix C provides more detail on how we combine static and stable. Appendix D describes the different type of recidivism outcomes and how they were calculated. Lastly, Appendix E describes the new risk ratios. By this point, you should know that we needed a revised workbook to improve how we communicate risk, that there are a number of different resources available to evaluators and users to help with this shift, and that the new workbook has new normative information, combination rules, and much, much more to help evaluators. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and stay tuned. Based on the number of requests I've already received, I will be making a full-length video on the standardized risk levels, and a 5-minute version of that video for those of you who are in a rush. Another future video will be on the STABLE-2007 meta-analysis, which is currently under review. As soon as the paper is accepted, I will release a video on whether stable total scores and item scores predict recidivism, and if it is incremental to static 99R. All these videos will be freely available for evaluators to use. I just ask that you reference this video in your presentation and work. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. I am not a social media or YouTube person by nature, but I believe researchers and test developers have a responsibility to make knowledge as accessible as possible. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly.